what's underneath America's well-known history? There's the dark mark of slavery, the ongoing impact of systemic racism, the unfair treatment of Native American people, and the challenges faced by marginalized communities. We need to look beyond the surface to see these uncomfortable truths that are often ignored in popular stories about America. By uncovering these hidden realities from America's past, we can start to move towards a future that's fairer and more equal. Roots of systemic racism. Understanding the roots of systemic racism uncovers a complicated history deeply tied to America's past. Even before the country began, the mistreatment of enslaved Africans and the forced removal of Native peoples left lasting wounds on its foundations. This created racial hierarchies that still exist today. The transatlantic slave trade and violent acts against Native communities established a cycle of oppression and loss. This systemic discrimination affects African Americans, Native Americans, and other marginalized groups more than others. Despite legal changes and social progress, past injustices still affect our society today. Marginalized groups face obstacles in education, like unequal access to resources and unfair disciplinary actions, which keep them from succeeding. Economic disparities also continue, with historic injustices like redlining and biased lending practices widening the wealth gap between different races. Dark legacy of slavery. The impact of slavery in America reaches far into its past and still affects life today. Enslaved people worked on plantations in the South and helped industries grow in the North, boosting the country's economy. Even after slavery ended, unfair laws like Jim Crow and segregation kept inequalities alive, dividing society. Besides economic harm, slavery caused deep emotional pain, tearing apart families and erasing cultural identities. This history still affects how Americans live today, shaping how we interact, what we believe, and how we experience life. The effects of slavery passed down through generations, along with ongoing biases and obstacles, make achieving equality and justice difficult. Recognizing and dealing with slavery's legacy is important for healing, bringing people together, and moving towards a fairer future. Indigenous genocide and land theft. When European colonizers came to the Americas, it brought a dark time for indigenous people. They faced genocide, had their land taken away, and were forced to leave their homes. Treaties were broken, unfair deals were made, and violence was used to take Native American land, which led to the destruction of their communities and cultures. Despite centuries of resilience, indigenous people still face many challenges today. These include poverty, drug and alcohol abuse, and losing their cultural traditions. These problems come from past injustices and ongoing unfair treatment, which make it hard for them to get what they need and keep their traditions alive. Despite this, indigenous communities keep fighting for their rights and freedom. They work to protect their land, preserve their culture, and strengthen their communities, even though they still face many obstacles and hardships. The civil rights movement of the 20th century, led by inspiring figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, showed the power of people coming together to make change. Using peaceful protests, boycotts, and brave acts, this movement pushed for big legal changes and changes in society. It challenged laws and practices that kept people of different races apart and treated them unfairly. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were two important laws that came out of this time. They made it illegal to discriminate against people based on their race, color, religion, sex, or where they came from. But the impact of the civil rights movement goes beyond just these laws. It changed how Americans see and treat each other, inspiring people to keep working for fairness and equality. Despite the progress made, there are still big challenges to overcome. Differences in things like education and the justice system show that not everyone is treated the same. People of color often don't have the same chances or get treated fairly in these areas. Mass incarceration. The war on drugs, started in the 1980s, has had big effects, especially on communities of color. It's made racial inequality and putting lots of people in jail even worse. This campaign was supposed to stop drug crime, but it mainly focused on minority neighborhoods. Because of tough laws, lots of people, especially non-violent ones from marginalized communities, ended up in jail for a long time. Even though people of all races use drugs at similar rates, African Americans and Hispanics get put in jail a lot more than white people. This shows there are unfair biases in the justice system. Behind this unfairness is a system that makes money from putting people in jail, making it like modern-day slavery. This history of unfairness shows we need to change how the justice system works to make things fairer for everyone. Eugenics movement. During the early 20th century, the United States saw the emergence of a robust eugenics movement, driven by the prevailing ideas of social Darwinism and a growing interest in applying biological principles to societal issues. This movement sought to actively shape the genetic composition of the population, advocating for the promotion of desirable traits while suppressing those considered undesirable. One of the most alarming facets of this movement was the implementation of coercive measures, notably forced sterilization. Laws were enacted in several states allowing for the compulsory sterilization of individuals deemed unfit to reproduce, disproportionately targeting marginalized groups such as the poor, disabled, and ethnic minorities. Furthermore, the eugenics movement often intersected with discriminatory ideologies, reinforcing existing inequalities and perpetuating systemic oppression. Despite its eventual decline, the legacy of the eugenics movement serves as a poignant reminder of the dangers of pseudoscience, prejudice, and unchecked state power in shaping human lives. Japanese internment camps. During World War II, the United States government forcibly relocated and incarcerated around 120,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps, depriving them of their civil liberties solely based on their ethnicity. The mass relocation was implemented under Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1942, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Despite the majority of Japanese Americans being citizens of the United States, they were subjected to suspicion and prejudice, leading to their forced removal from their homes and communities. The internment camps, often hastily constructed and lacking proper infrastructure, subjected Japanese Americans to harsh living conditions. Families were forced to live in cramped barracks, often with inadequate heating or cooling and limited access to basic amenities such as sanitation facilities and medical care. The loss of their homes and businesses resulted in significant economic hardship for many Japanese American families, as they were unable to maintain their livelihoods or assets. Whitewashed narrative. In American history, the stories often told leave out or sugarcoat the terrible things done to minority groups. Textbooks which tell these stories often skip over or minimize the hard truths, making it seem like America's past was better than it really was. They don't fully capture the suffering and strength of marginalized groups like slaves and Native Americans. But hearing from different perspectives is really important. When we listen to the voices of those who were silenced in the past, we get a better picture of what really happened. It's through these forgotten stories that we see the true American history, one of struggle, success, and the ongoing fight for fairness. Facing America's past means looking at all the good and bad things that happened, not just the good. Only then can we start to heal the wounds of history and move towards a future where everyone is treated fairly.